Thank you, Mo. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session today. My name is Jayant Menon. I'm with the Economics Program at ISEAS. And this, I think, is the only session focused on economic issues. And as you can see, I'm here mainly to provide gender balance in a very one-sided panel, which is good to see. We are very short on time, so I'm going to very quickly set the stage by making 3 quick points just to set the stage. I think the first thing to note is that this region is slowing. The ADB's latest forecast a few weeks ago has Southeast Asia growing at 4.6%. And just a couple of days ago, the World Bank's East Asia update had it growing at the slowest pace in about 50 years. So growth is not looking good, and it's mainly related to China, of course, but there are other political and geopolitical issues playing into it. And that's the second point, that all these factors, geopolitical and economic, are raising risks in the region. We've already heard about some of these risks in the earlier panel, and we'll hear more later. But on the economic side, I think this morning we heard from Mr. Choi and the ASEAN Secretary General about a number of these trends, the rise in protectionism, the return of the popularity of industrial policy, not just in the rich countries that can probably afford that kind of largesse, but worryingly, even in poor countries that feel they need to compete on the same front. And I think all of this is happening in the context of various technological and climate change disruptions, particularly affecting poor countries, but technological change in the form of the race towards the digital economy and the rise of AI is also going to pose challenges for this region. So ASEAN is facing many challenges, not just the slowing growth and the rising risks. There's also internal issues. We've heard about Myanmar. We'll hear more about the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea later. So how does it respond to all of this? Will these other non-economic issues crowd out the economic agenda? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. What should it try and do to ensure that the economic agenda stays on track? I'm glad I'm only having to pose these questions. The answers will be attempted by 3 very good panelists today. And let me very quickly start with the first. Our first speaker today is Dr. Sanchita Basu, who is an economist in the research department at ADB at the moment. But before that, she spent many years at ISEAS as lead researcher at the ASEAN Studies Centre. So Sanchita, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me thank ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute and the organizers for inviting me to this flagship forum. As Jay mentioned, and I would like to share again, is that I'm an alumnus of ISEAS family, and I've spent around 14 years at the institute. It is also the time when the Southeast Asian countries were advancing their regional economic cooperation from having individual agendas like AFTA, AFAS, and AIA, to a more comprehensive one, which we know these days as ASEAN Economic Community. During my time at ISEAS, that also hosts the ASEAN Studies Centre, I not only saw a policy practitioner's perspective of regionalism, but also how the discussion grew and evolved over the years. So I will share my views based on my research and experience over all this time. Can I? Yeah. So I'm given this guiding question, whether I see the low level of intra-ASEAN trade and investment as ASEAN's failure to pursue more ambitious reforms, or it's that ASEAN is using regionalism to promote globalization. And I would like to argue that ASEAN is using regionalism to promote, or a different word could be to manage globalization. And so let me now elaborate on this, on my views and argument using a couple of facts about ASEAN. So ASEAN has often been criticized for a lack of market-driven pressure for cooperation. And what it means is that the intra-ASEAN trade share has always been low or sometimes declining and hovering around 18 to 25%. And that makes the countries an inappropriate case for regional integration. But it is only half of the story. Because when I observe ASEAN, I see the countries have both economic and strategic rationale to undertake economic cooperation. First is, of course, ASEAN losing FDI to China was one of the biggest concern for the countries to get together in the late 1990s or early 2000. So the countries decided to offer a bigger market space and committed for structural reforms through institutional building, regulations, infrastructure to make the region more competitive. All these efforts of liberalization and facilitation measures were believed to help the countries or the firms in the countries to participate in the regional production network. So this is the international part of ASEAN cooperation. But there are some strategic drives also, as every countries with certain kind of public policies, we have winners and losers. And there are a great number of homegrown firms in ASEAN countries who are not part of, say, the international linkages to export and imports. So the countries realize that cooperation among like-minded participants will help them to exercise some form of protectionism at home and as well as in a bigger geographical space of ASEAN. So it will allow the governments to exclude the uncompetitive domestic sectors from the trade liberalization efforts, at least for a while. So this is why I meant like ASEAN cooperation is trying to balance the global trends as well as some domestic imperatives. So the countries realize that while a deeper cooperation form of economic cooperation is important to match the demands for globalization or manage globalization, it is also helpful to have a regional cooperation arrangement that can accommodate the varied domestic interest of ASEAN members. So to serve this twin underlying rationale, it is often observed that AEC policy documents are broad in nature. So there is an inbuilt flexibilities in most of the policy documents. And the other factor I would like to share that we often talk about intra-regional trade in ASEAN, but ASEAN integration is a lot more than that. It is trade liberalization plus arrangement as parties have agreed to remove barriers to trade and have also agreed to undertake cooperation on related regulations such as harmonization of standards, investment policy, competition policy, and others. So we should not be judging ASEAN by just looking at the tariff rates or the extent of intra-ASEAN trade. One more stylist fact about ASEAN that I would like to share with you all is that the regional cooperation approach followed in the region. And I often say that ASEAN is like 10 individual houses in a gated community which binds, and the ASEAN Economic Community, the policy document, binds them together with certain common rules in that housing society. And in ASEAN, while AEC policies are designed at regional level, implementation is done by the individual countries. So the AEC policy document provides the ingredients for these individual households or the individual countries on how can they make the individual houses more attractive. But because each of these houses have different kind of resources available, we may not have a dish which like taste or look similar. And just outside the gated community, we have other stakeholders sitting, be it foreign governments or investors who would like to see what the areas of investment. So this is how I see as ASEAN economic cooperation. And this is against the EU cooperation, which I often say is a kind of a single condo, which has, say, 28 apartments, and there are very strict rules and regulations. The other fact about ASEAN is that it's a kind of a new regionalism. So if I look at ASEAN over these three periods, ASEAN in the 1990s, 2000, and post-2015, I will say why it's a mixed region is it has characteristics of new regionalism. Of course, the one that I've highlighted in red is where ASEAN have not fared too well. But if we see the other characteristics like mixed nature of countries responding to globalization, multiple regionalism, which means they are not, every country is not part to one, but a multiple regional cooperation process. So we see ASEAN perfectly fitting into this, in this description. And new regionalism is often a state-led project managing the global and the domestic forces. So what we see is that, that ASEAN cooperation evolved in the 90s as there was growing interdependence, there was doubt over the GATT-based global trading system, formation of NAFTA and APEC, and then it evolved over the years where we saw two major crises, then the COVID and growing nationalism. And if you observe during this time, the narrative of ASEAN has also changed from saying itself a single market and production base. ASEAN now says we want to integrated and a competitive region. So it also wants to manage the expectation. Instead of saying a single market production base, it's saying, okay, we want to be an integrated region. But there are some domestic factors which also pulls back the regional integration. And that's why I mentioned that a common thread across these blueprints is like there is scope of different way to interpret ASEAN action. So there is some ambiguities in the blueprint. And why? What are the domestic factors? ASEAN lacks indigenous big firms to support liberalization. In the early days, there were a lot of SOEs and which prevented the demand for liberalization. And the market-driven economic integration is spread over a bigger geography of East Asia. So there are various factors. So the interplay of global and the domestic factors shaped up ASEAN. So let me skip this slide in interest of time. So how can ASEAN economic cooperation remain relevant going forward? And I will say, like, of course, ASEAN will continue to balance the global and the domestic factors. And currently, what are we seeing at the global landscape is the countries are still feeling the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. Geopolitical tensions have heightened, bringing issues of, say, friendshoring and nearshoring. And climate change is viewed as a systemic challenge, and digitalization can make or break equity in a society. So many people will say here that the pressures will go against ASEAN, but I will say, like, okay, we need to look back, reflect, and say, so far ASEAN has delivered the public goods of regional integration. So maybe it needs to do something more or reset the approach to regional integration to deliver, manage the global pressure. So what do I suggest here is ASEAN needs to have clearly aim what it wants to achieve through AEC. And going by the latest buzzword in policy making, it should say inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economic growth. And if you follow ASEAN, so this has changed. In the 90s, we used to say it's to deliver on the robust economic growth through trade and investment. But now we are saying inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So automatically, we are not expecting a 6 to 7% growth rate, but maybe 4 or 5% growth rate. So the next question comes, what kind of regional cooperation is desired? Of course, the very simple answer is stronger. But we know by the ASEAN culture that there will always remain a room for flexibility. And how far you want to give this flexibility? How do you want to, is it good or bad? That's a constant debate that the countries are facing. And even today we are sitting here, we will also say, I'm sure there will be like 70, 80% who will say flexibility is not good. And some of us will say, okay, we need to respect ASEAN culture. And the last box is where I'm saying, what actions will deliver stronger AEC? And this time, I am particularly saying 3-4 things which also map up to my first box on inclusive, resilient, and sustainable ASEAN. So we now all know, like, we want people-centric deliverables. So we need to make sure education and healthcare, they're discussed at the ASEAN level. Of course, they are currently in the ASCC, the socio-cultural pillar, but they need to be brought under the AEC. So we need a more integrated approach. Of course, we need to cooperate to facilitate digital transformation in the national economies and the region, and we all know our leaders have started negotiating the ASEAN Regional Digital Transformation Agreement. Sustainability and green economy, and of course, our traditional agenda of trade and investment policies, and this time there should be a bit more emphasis on the services sector and the regulation, and the facilitation for stronger supply chains. So if you see, I'm saying things in a more targeted fashion, and which the current time requires. The demand side is there, and we are not simply saying we need economic growth and we need trade and investment without understanding how it connects to people. So this is my last slide, but the issue is all these things are easier said than done, and there are many challenges. The first is, do we have a common understanding of these buzzwords, inclusive, resilience, and sustainability? And say particularly with these days more informed audience, as a government, I would always request that we need to specify with numbers. What is inclusive? Maybe we are talking about 90% of population in ASEAN have access to quality education. So that way it sounds more convincing rather than give a very broad word, inclusive and resilience. What do we mean by resilience? Are we talking about supply chain resilience? Or so how do we define that, and how do we measure it in some form of certain indicators? So that's the first issue we need to overcome. Second is the issues of economic cooperations are more complex now. They're more thematic. It's not a tariff rate which we are talking about reducing. We are talking about digital transformation. We are talking about climate change, which cannot be tackled by a number, or it's not a responsibility of one ministry in a country. So it is a responsibility of multiple ministries within a country. So we need, for many of these issues, we need a whole of government approach. So you can well imagine for this digital transformation negotiation, you have 10 countries. Maybe every country has 7 sectors that need to contribute to this commitment to net zero transition in ASEAN or in the digital transformation. So how complex will be that negotiation? The other thing is, of course, resources are limited in ASEAN member countries, and this is not a new story. We have heard it for the past 2 decades, but now the resources are more stretched because of IPAF and other regional arrangement in the region. And finally, we need to keep in mind that leadership across countries have changed. So they may not see ASEAN as what our past leaders saw in the 90s or 2000, but I will say they will have the wealth of knowledge in the system, and they can learn from their mistakes in the past. And before I end my presentation, so my net what I want to say is ASEAN need to reset its regional cooperation approach, and most particularly increase the pace of discussion and policy making, because the global factors are changing very fast. Second is also, how do you want to communicate ASEAN progress in integration? We cannot say like we have 2,000 meetings and we have, say, 25 sectoral cooperation, we have 1,700 action point in, because, okay, it's my bread and butter to understand what does it mean, how does it map to the benefits for sectors in a country, what does it mean for reforms, but an investor doesn't have a time to dedicate to understand what does this 2,000 meetings mean, and these, say, 23 sectoral groups, and then what, 1,700 AEC blueprint action plans. So someone need to do the homework and translate it into real knowledge communication to ASEAN stakeholders. And the countries should not look for just 30 seconds, should not look for a slew of measures to be delivered under AEC blueprint. They should be looking at a more focused approach so that we can bring in greater efficiency in ASEAN discussion and give people more like the content of economic integration rather than just saying things like we will help in raising awareness at ASEAN region. So people want more content subject with numbers, which we say now these days, evidence-based policy research, so that the people on the ground are more convinced about ASEAN integration. So I will stop here. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanchita. I'm sorry to rush you, but we are tight on time. But I think you've raised a number of issues we can come back to in the discussion later, including how regional cooperation and integration should be seen as means rather than ends in themselves. And when we talk about these new terms we throw around, inclusive, sustainable, resilient, often there are trade-offs that need to be struck. And we need to be clear about what exactly those trade-offs are. Right, so thank you. Let me move on quickly to our next speaker. I think we have to recognize that ASEAN is not the only game in town. The members themselves are involved in multiple other agreements, bilateral, regional, and mega-regional. And so how do we get ASEAN to work with these various different agreements? This is one of the issues I think Julia Tijaja, our next speaker, will address. And let me quickly introduce Julia. I should say that all their full CVs are on our website, so please look at them if you want more details. But Julia is currently the Head of Markets and Competitiveness at Prospera, which is a major Australia-Indonesia partnership for economic development. She's also an Associate Senior Fellow at ISEAS, and before that, she spent many years as Director of the Integration Monitoring Unit at the ASEAN Secretariat. So Julia, over to you, and it's close to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, good. I guess it's good afternoon now. Director Troy, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. So if I may have my presentation up, thank you. So I'll be spending the next 15 minutes talking about how can we improve ASEAN Economic Community or AEC resilience against economic fragmentation. But before I start, just a slight disclaimer that I'm here in my capacity as the Associate Senior Fellow of ICS, not as the Head of Markets of Competitors of Prospera. And I'm very pleased to receive this invitation and to have the chance again to share some of my thoughts about ASEAN. And I think I've been very lucky to be speaking after Sanchita because she has summarized very well about the progress of ASEAN integration to date. 15 minutes is a very short time, so I can focus on more on global fragmentation and the impact on the AEC. So for the next 15 minutes, I'll be presenting very briefly on why AEC is at the crossroad. Sanchita has presented to you all the progress that has been made to date. But I would also argue that while there has been some good progress, there's definitely remain some key gaps. And the global economic fragmentation is actually add further weight to these gaps. And then I'll be touching about how global economic fragmentation is actually impacting on the AEC And what does AEC resilience actually mean? I think this was one of the point that was raised. We need to get some sort of shared understanding of some of these terms, inclusions, resilience, sustainability, and what resilience actually mean in the context of global economic fragmentation. And then I would highlight about a little bit about free trade agreements. This is one of the tools that can be used to strengthen the AEC resilience. But it is also not the only tools, because there is a lot of other things that's now happening, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that is not a traditional FTAs. And then last but not least, we'll be looking at ways on how to actually future-proof the AEC. So very quick summary about AEC being at the crossroad. We are now, I think, at the start of the last quarter of AEC 2025. And we have made some good progress. For a start, there has been some key frameworks in place, and these are not static. We already have agreements on trade in goods, trade in services, investment, and ASEAN has also gradually been updating and improving on some of these frameworks. We have a very wide array of sectoral cooperation in the AEC, ranging from agriculture, tourism, energy and minerals, finance, and so on. And this sectoral cooperation has deepened. There has been more activities, initiatives, frameworks put in place, and it has been evolving as well. So in a number of these key sectors, you actually see the mainstreaming of current issues like sustainability and so on being included into the work program. And when it comes to our external engagement with external partners, likewise, it has expanded. I think earlier on this morning, the Secretary General of ASEAN has briefed about how there's been an increasing number of partners that ASEAN is engaging on. In the context of the AEC, you can actually see there are new FTAs coming into play, and also the upgrading and the review of these FTAs. And last but not least, ASEAN has also been adding cooperation in the new and emerging areas. So even that goes even beyond what's actually reflected in the AEC Blueprint 2025. These include the fourth industrial revolution, circular economy, blue economy, and most recently, we also see ASEAN adopting the ASEAN strategy on carbon neutrality. And I think we can all agree that despite the continued challenges in the global recovery and some unevenness in the region, all in all, we have made pretty good recovery from the COVID-19. But there are some key gaps remain, one of which is actually implementation remains an issue. ASEAN has been prolific in putting in place strategies, frameworks, roadmaps, and so on. But implementation of these initiatives requires a lot of work and coordination at the national level. The second issue is on impact. So this is perhaps relates to what Sanchita is saying just now. You can have thousands of action lines, but at the end of the day, the businesses, including your micro, small, and medium enterprises, they would actually want to see concrete action on the ground. And this tends to be some of the more very practical initiatives, like your digital payment connectivity, or perhaps it's more about having ASEAN single window well operating and connected to some of our major partners, or even having the ASEAN customs transit system working very properly so we can actually improve our intra-regional trade. Institutional readiness is a key issue because issues are becoming more complex. Sanchita, you mentioned about 10 houses in one gated community. I think we have 3 of that actually in the complex. One's for the ASEAN political security community, 10 houses for the ASEAN economic community, and 10 houses for the ASEAN socio-cultural community. And when the issues are actually cross-cutting, when geopolitical issues are affecting trade and investment, you can no longer act as 3 separate pillars. And this is, I think, where the greatest gap we have now in the ASEAN institution. Stakeholder engagement and relevance. We've been adding number of engagement with the business sector, and that's great. But has this engagement be meaningful? Do we actually have an effective feedback loop in place? So I won't touch for too long, but this basically just to give you a sense of the share of ASEAN total trade and total FDI flows. On the left-hand side is FDI, right-hand side is trade. As expected, China is our largest external trade partners. But the US has also been growing in importance, right? And at the end of the day, the intra-ASEAN, although it's declining, is actually still comprised of the largest share of ASEAN trade. When it comes to investment, the pattern actually different quite considerably, with the US being our largest source of FDI, and then you also see the growing importance of the EU, and then China more or less at 7% there. There are two things that I hope we can take away from this slide. The first one is, yes, if you look at this, US and China play a very important role both in trade and investment. The share for investment, the combined share, hasn't actually changed much at between 22-23% over the past 10 years. But the concentration of trade from these two partners have actually increased from 20 to 30%. But still, you still have the remaining 70%. So there is actually still a lot of room for engagement, for diversification with other partners as well, including ASEAN-owned intra-ASEAN trade and investment. And this is the point that the Secretary General raised this morning. And in fact, strengthening intra-ASEAN trade can actually improve your resilience amid global fragmentation. Right, so this is, I actually borrowed this chart from Christina Fong, lead researcher for economics from the ASEAN Studies Centre of ISEAS. And I think here she actually demonstrated very well about how US import patterns and China import patterns have shifted only in the past 5 years. I think the change in the China import patterns has not shifted significantly, but there has been some slight increase in the share of ASEAN in certain product groups. But it is more stand out, I think, in the shift in the US import patterns, where just 5 years ago, ASEAN's share in US imports on electrical and electronic goods was half of that of China's share. And in just 5 years, we are actually now at par. ASEAN and China is actually at par. So again, you do see that some shift is probably uneven across the different partners. So this is probably the most important slide of this presentation. So I'm just going to focus on the two impacts of global fragmentation on the AEC. The first one is about the supply chain fragmentation and the economic impact of that. And the second one is the impact on institutions. So using the word de-risking, because that seems to be the acceptable euphemism that we have so far. Basically, the move away from China's supply chain has in fact been happening not just recently. It has been happening before COVID. It has even been happening before the US, the tariff wars that was introduced in 2018, 2019. And this is in a sense, it's probably just for good business sense. Wages and costs in China has been rising. And investors are being forced to basically go and look for more cost-efficient locations to do business. What has changed is that the factor of security has now entered into the picture much more significantly. But it is also not very easy to simply remove your entire supply chain from China and move it elsewhere, right? Because supply chain is sticky. You cannot build supply chain efficiency overnight. You cannot build your qualified network of suppliers overnight as well. The same thing with the skills and the regulations that's in place. So it is likely that you're not gonna see the complete shift of the existing value chain to elsewhere, but this is going to enter into considerations more when it comes to future investment and supply chain strategy. What does that mean for ASEAN? On the good side, it's an opportunity for ASEAN to become an alternative hub. And we've seen that in the previous graph where ASEAN has been playing a more dominant role in US import patterns. But we also know that this is not something that's evenly benefiting ASEAN member states, because at the end of the day, your short-term comparative advantage and capacity varies among ASEAN member states, and our geopolitical distance from the US and to other partners also varies across the member states as well. Then the last thing that I think ASEAN needs to keep in mind is that there is a cost to uncertainty. Yes, there might be short-term opportunities and gains here, but at the end of the day, the increase in the use of unilateral measures and all that actually create business uncertainty that can be costly to ASEAN, even if indirectly in the future. Challenges, I think there's a lot of studies that's been done on this, but at the end of the day, fragmentation actually create a diseconomy of scales, reducing profit. It reduces the incentive to invest in productivity-enhancing measures. It leads to higher costs to consumers, and at the end of the day, that risks all translate into lower growth of the economy. On the institutional side, you have the weakening of multilateralism. So basically, we see more of, there is a less reference to rules-based international order. With all these unilateral measures, there are less transparency and predictability in the partners' policy. And then with this trust deficit among some key players, you see reduced dialogue in some areas where you actually have shared concerns, and it would be better to come up with joint solutions. And of course, this is also affecting the level playing field when people are no longer engaging in an open, inclusive, multilateral institutions, then the one that will be at the disadvantage is the small and middle power economies. And then the second part of the institutional risk comes to the emergence of the parallel narratives and frameworks to ASEAN. To an extent that can lead to a reduced interest and relevance in ASEAN-led frameworks from our partners, but also internally, because if our member states are engaged in so many of these multiple ones, even if they remain committed to ASEAN, at the end of the day, our resources is limited, and that can be reduced focus and resources available to actually advance the ASEAN agenda. There is no single definition of resilience, unfortunately. There's a bunch of scholars that are still working on this at the moment. But usually when you talk about resilience, you talk about three things. One is endurance. How do you make sure that you preserve your core, that AEC still achieve its objective and goals amid the shocks of global fragmentation? Secondly, how do we adapt? How do we need to do things differently? Do we need to recalibrate because there's a different recent developments? That means there are other things that now becomes a priorities. And are there new opportunities that we can take advantage of? Lastly, it's about transformation. And this refers to the notion that you don't want to just be bouncing back, but you want to be bouncing forward. You want to thrive in the new era. Okay, maybe here. Yes. So one of the issue about AEC resilience in global economic fragmentation is that what does resilience actually mean? And I would argue that in the context of global fragmentation, it means mostly two things. One, ASEAN needs to ensure that we are safeguarding our access to markets. Not just markets in terms of markets for you to sell your products, but also where you are sourcing your raw materials and inputs. Your access to technology, your access to financing and investment, and also to skills. And secondly, it's about safeguarding your certainty of rules in your trade and your investment framework. And one way to do that is through your FTAs. ASEAN have its own FTAs. It has its own bilateral FTAs as well. Of course, it has RCEP, and it's currently negotiating with ASEAN Canada on an FTA. And in the interest of time, I just want to highlight that these FTAs are not the end goal. You know, negotiating first is already costly, but once you negotiate and you agreed and you sign the agreement, first you have to ratify it, and then you actually need to start implementing and utilizing them in order to reap your benefits. And just taking one example, all the yellow highlights actually highlight that ASEAN FTAs are not static. It is constantly being reviewed and upgraded. Taking a specific example of the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand FTA, which is already one of the most comprehensive FTA initially in 2010, we have recently upgraded that to include new issues such as supply chain resilience, even new chapters including MSME and trade and sustainable development. So though it is possible for ASEAN to use FTAs to internalize new risks and issues and address that into the FTA. But I would argue that FTAs alone is not sufficient as a strategy. It is not the only game in town. First, there are also non-ASEAN-led frameworks, bilateral, CPTPP, and more importantly, there are also non-FTAs, both ASEAN-led frameworks and beyond. Very quickly, one example of non-FTA ASEAN framework I want to highlight is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. When everyone's come up with their own narrative on the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN was at risk to be dragged into the different interpretation of the term, and it comes out with its own narrative that really focus on economic cooperation and inclusion. And it focuses on the 4 pillars of connectivity, maritime cooperation, sustainable development, and economic cooperation. It started as its own narrative, and increasingly you start seeing partners adopting that language into their own statements and references. And most recently at the ASEAN Summit, you see a number of partners actually issuing joint statement with ASEAN on how they want to cooperate on the AOIP. And And you, but that's why, again, just to sum up, FTAs is no silver bullet. Most of the issues affecting trade and investment now are not traditionally included in FTAs. You might be facing issues arising from your non-FTA partners, and FTAs are generally costly to negotiate. It takes years and resources, and once negotiated, it's not always effectively utilized. And you also see that there are new approaches on how you can address new issues in a more modular way, including digital economy agreements, and also Indo-Pacific economic framework that focuses more about rules and standards rather than about market access. So maybe just to sum up, what can be done? First, for AEC to continue to be relevant and resilient, it needs to offer clear value and impact. Quoting a famous line from Indonesia former Foreign Minister Pak Marty Matalagawa, that ASEAN centrality actually needs to be earned. You cannot take that for granted. So you need to offer value both to your partners, but also to your own member states. What do they get from this regional economic integration? ASEAN needs to engage, as it did in the context of the Indo-Pacific, and take lead in the context of RCEP to shape the regional architecture, improve coordination across pillars, platforms, and initiatives, collaborate with stakeholders, including beyond your traditional stakeholders. Businesses in some of these major economy might actually be ASEAN's strongest allies in this case. Not everyone wants to see global fragmentation. And last but not least, strengthen ASEAN institutions, cross-pillar efficient decision-making, streamline and focus the different initiatives, and also improve on information sharing across platform. I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia. And again, sorry to rush you a little, but time is really our enemy today. But I liked how you said that FTAs are not a silver bullet. Maybe too many FTAs are actually too many bullets in the end. But let's now move on finally, last but not least, to Dr. Min Tang, who insists that she's not an economist, and who can blame her? But she's the founding executive director of the Tech for Good Institute. She's also currently a senior fellow at the Center for Governance and Sustainability at NUS. Min, 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Jayant. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having us here. As the founding executive director of the Tech for Good Institute, let me very quickly introduce our institute because we're so young. We're only 2 years old. We're a non-profit entity, seed funded by Grab, to contribute to the development, adoption, and governance of digital technology, and also the business models that they enable, so that the promise of technology may be leveraged for inclusive, sustainable, resilient growth. It's really an honor for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me to ask me to talk about a big topic, digitalization, AI, and the future of work, within an even bigger question, which is economic integration ASEAN's only reason for being? So I can talk a lot about tech, but I'll talk about it primarily in the context of work. Sanchita mentioned that economic integration is not a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, it's only a means to an end, and it really is a means to an end twice over. First, to drive growth, but also to build that more connected and peaceful, prosperous, and resilient region. Digitalization, in the same way, will realize this journey because with digital solutions, you can communicate across cultures, collaborate across sectors, do business across borders. But digitalization is also not an end in itself. Yes, I said it will drive economic growth, but it will also enable the transitions that we need to see within this decade. We talked about green economies, circular economies, low carbon economies. You actually can't do that without digitalization. Digitalization has also had tremendous impact socially and culturally. So these are the pillars coming together that you talked about, Julia. Let me set the context really quickly. First, the rate of adoption is changing consumer behaviors in a really sticky way. Approximately 100 million of our region's 460 million internet users only came online 3 years ago, within the last 3 years. And in our research, we found that 1 in 2 consumers had adopted online and mobile payments, and of these, 90% expressed that they will continue. Second, these new users have leapfrogged legacy technology and business models. So I'll ask you, how many of here remember using a desktop? I'm old enough. A few. And how many of you remember or do use a laptop? Most of us, right? In Southeast Asia, mobile devices are the main point of access to the internet. Mobile traffic actually accounts for 2/3 of web traffic. They're not even using a laptop anymore. In Indonesia, for example, mobile penetration is 125%. Fixed broadband is only 5%. So this mobile first and mobile only behavior means fundamentally different user needs, expectations, and experience. In financial services, for example, businesses and individuals are just skipping the traditional service providers like banks. For example, we found in our research that 3/4 of small businesses with loans from digital providers had previously been unable to secure financing from banks. So digital financial services are filling this gap in financial inclusion. Now, this rapid change is taking place in the context of diversity of this region. This has been mentioned before by a few speakers. We comprise over 100 ethnicities, speak over 1,000 languages, and although we are avid social media users, about 150 million adults in Southeast Asia, or nearly 1/3 of our population, still do not have connectivity. So our digital trajectory has to be regionally oriented, multicultural, locally fit for purpose, and inclusive, all at the same time. And this is a really tall order, but it is a must-win challenge for ASEAN. The future of our economies lies in our ability to support the digital pivot for existing trade and industries, while also creating new value through digital products, services, or content. The ASEAN Single Window, for example, is an example of this pivot of existing trade and industry. So you have to harmonize trade standards, paperless trade, e-invoicing, customs cooperation, supports regional supply chain connectivity, reducing time, reducing costs, and makes ASEAN more competitive. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the digital-only companies offering digital outputs like software as a service, digital platforms, digital content. Immediately you might think of search like Google or social like Facebook, but there are many other digital-only business models. For example, Southeast Asia currently has 45 million streaming video on demand subscriptions. And then between these two is the broad online to offline sector that uses tech to remove the transactional friction in the consumption of goods and services. And the use cases span really widely: travel, transport, food, retail, education, healthcare, you name it. And for all of this to happen, not only do we need digitalization, we need digital integration. So for economic integration to happen, you need digital integration. We need common enablers like fintech, e-payments, digital identities, trusted data flows, personal data protection, and online consumer protection. To this end, ASEAN is working really hard to foster trusted and integrated regional digital environment, underpinned by the ASEAN DEFA, for which negotiations are due to start very soon. This is one of the non-FTA agreements that, Julia, you mentioned before. Where does this leave us with regard to the future of work? And I'll touch on very quickly who it affects, where the work gets done, and how it will be done. So let's start with who. There's a lot of focus on big companies, yeah? But across ASEAN, we cannot forget our 71 million micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. These MSMEs account for 97% of all businesses, and really all ASEAN member states understand that MSMEs must benefit from participating in a regional digital economy if growth is going to be equitable. The Tech for Good Institute's research showed that 1 in 5 MSMEs leverage digital platforms to grow. And these companies can range from single individuals like Khairullah Ming. If you haven't had his sambal, go on Shopee and you can buy it. He's in Malaysia, he serves Singapore, he serves Indonesia. To companies like VersaFleet, based in Singapore, serving as MSMEs across the whole region with logistic fulfillment technology. Another key segment is the digitally mobile native, the digital and mobile native demographic. I've been looking all morning at the 38th ASEAN Dialogue. Over 60% of Southeast Asia is under the age of 35. So they weren't born before the ASEAN Roundtable started. These digital natives are or will be the consumers and workers shaping the digital economy. You call them Gen Z, you call them Gen Alpha. They have a propensity towards an interconnected reality. Social media, video on demand, games, and online worlds allow these communities to form around shared interests. They spawn cultural identities that transcend barriers of language and distance. I think someone asked about ASEAN citizens just now. These are the global citizens. K-pop might be what comes to mind, but actually this trend extends beyond music and entertainment. Recent research by Open Space Ventures, sorry we don't have all the countries, this was what the survey was done, found that the Southeast Asia youth had a higher interest than their elders in the politics of other countries in the region because they're really interconnected. So the digitally enabled worker shifts expectations of where we work. Remote work is here to stay. We've got digital solutions like cloud, digital communications, collaborative working tools will enable work from home, workations, permanent international remote working. Companies are incorporating remote working into their HR strategies, but then need to think about security, immigration, regulatory, and tax compliance. And within remote working, global outsourcing will grow at both the corporate and individual levels. You have countries like the Philippines and Malaysia that have been global outsourcing destinations for many, many years. Their challenge is how to stay competitive. Initial research on the use of generative AI for customer support agents in the Philippines, for example, showed a productivity boost by 14% on average. But for the novice and lower skilled workers, the productivity boost was 35%. For startups, this kind of connectiveness is vital. Last year, the Tech for Good Institute served as a knowledge partner on the framework for promoting the growth of digital startups in ASEAN. And this was endorsed by the ASEAN digital ministers this year. Talent mobility was identified as a key enabler for startup growth, facilitating cross-border knowledge sharing, collaboration with partners, investors, clients, and team members. At the individual level, workers will have more options to work flexibly and for many companies at the same time. This is what you call the multi-earner, multi-platform earning phenomenon. And this is not just for gig workers. The digital nomad capitalizes on both these trends of international remote working and individual multi-platform earning. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have digital nomad visas, attracting digital workers who consume local services, but they also contribute to the vibrancy of local tech ecosystem. So Southeast Asian cities with a sweet spot of affordable cost of living and very good digital infrastructure will benefit from this kind of worker. Last but not least, how will we remain productive? We'll have to keep pace with technology. Earlier this year, the Tech for Good Institute solicited perspectives from over 130 stakeholders from the public, private, and civil sectors on the future of the digital economy and society across Southeast Asia. And the big concern was how governments could enable meaningful and productive participation in this fast-changing digital economy. So stakeholders cited the inclusion paradox, where online time and connectivity is actually spent for leisure, you call it the time pass economy, rather than for productive work or learning. So we don't want to be just digital consumers, we want to be workers, creators, investors, traders in the digital economies. So the stakeholders called for regular reviews of national skills roadmaps with education and training to follow suit. But then when you think that there's an estimate 85% of the jobs that we will see in 10 years don't exist today, how are skills roadmaps meant to keep up? With the disruptions due to the technology, plus the fact that we're all living longer and we need to have longer productive lives, the premium on specific skills is likely to shift to a premium on adaptiveness, the ability to learn fast, navigate ambiguity, and draw connections from past experience to new challenges. So governments have the challenge of rethinking education and certification, and at the same time, employers and clients should incentivize on-the-job learning. So for example, you might look at number of computer science graduates that you have, and investors and companies might look at, well, if I want to invest in a company, I might look at formal qualifications. How many data analysts are there? How many data engineers? How many certified information system security professional certifications there are? But at the same time, they're looking at the vibrancy of developer communities, such as GitHub, where developers are learning by doing. They don't have the formal qualifications, but they're gaining experience within a global community. Now, beyond competencies to use digital technologies, we also need to build the capability to develop and deploy. The unique nature of artificial intelligence and machine learning is a reliance on input data. And we talked about language just now. We have 1,000 living languages, yet globally 60% of current web content is in English. And half of the data sets in the world are produced from just 12 elite institutions. And if the data sets don't represent the populations that they serve, the models and products that come out of it may not be fit for purpose. I'll just give one quick example of a digital product that only we in ASEAN can build is Grab Maps. Across Southeast Asia, the quickest way from A to B may not be via a road. The locals know you should use this footbridge, hop on a ferry, or use an alleyway. These back alleys and alternative routes don't show up on road maps. So Grab partnered with merchants, drivers, and delivery partners to aggregate data on a daily basis along the principles of community-based mapping. Now, these geospatial capabilities, they do help Grab's core business, helping the drivers and delivery riders reach the destinations and the fried chicken to you more quickly. But to spur further innovation, Grab has added more than 800,000 kilometers of missing roads and routes to OpenStreetMap, which is open source. And Grab Maps is now used by Amazon Web Services, AWS, for its Amazon Location Service solution. And so you have organizations, e-commerce, transportation, logistics, telcos, government agencies that use this solution through AWS to improve their location-based services. Now, I'm just concluding my remarks here because I know that we're standing between you and lunch. Let me suggest two key roles for ASEAN to ensure that digitalization and emerging technologies like AI can enable a more inclusive, sustainable, and equitable future. First, we need to be more connected and interoperable as one ASEAN. ASEAN's potential hinges upon our region staying globally competitive and integrated into the global economy. And as I mentioned before, economic integration in the digital age needs digital integration. We need high-quality, affordable connectivity, especially in the remote and underserved areas. We need trusted cross-border data flows, digital identities, and e-payments with regulatory and standards alignment. Cooperation can help our region be more cyber secure, going beyond the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy to, for example, sharing information about cross-border cyber threats. Now, if we can do this, this brings me to my second point. Today, the key discussions on emerging technologies and the rules that govern them are dominated either by the big markets, EU, US, China, or by big companies especially. Individually, each ASEAN member state may not have the data, market, talent base, or compute power to realize innovation at a scale that defines the global economy. And yet together we can collaborate on large-scale tech and data projects to drive innovation, investment, and tech adoption. Next year, for example, Singapore is chairing the ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting and coordinating an ASEAN framework on AI governance and ethics. As a significant market of 660 million people, a population twice the size of the US, we can strengthen our collective position in shaping the trajectory of technology deployment at home as well as abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Min. I liked how you, again, emphasize how digitalization should be a means, not an end, to bring in greater inclusion within countries. But I think we also need to be perhaps working harder to ensure it doesn't raise new forms of inequality, and maybe we can come back to that. Now, we started at 12:20, And this panel is supposed to go for 75 minutes, but there is this insurmountable challenge of lunch. But I do want to have some time for questions. So I'll let the audience decide how hungry they are with the number of questions they ask. But I want to leave it open, and I'd like to start with the Q&A. So please raise your hand, and if you have a question directed to a particular person, please mention them by name. Yep. Okay. Yes, please. In the back.
Patrick here, not affiliated with any organization. Just out of curiosity, since we were talking about supply chains, has it ever been considered that ASEAN and the AEC framework moves to a supranational wealth fund that each of the individual countries contribute equally into their stake? Because I mean, the best way of lowering costs, increasing efficiency, and putting where your mouth is, putting your money where it matters is really chipping it together. And then at the national level, the supranational wealth fund can coordinate with the sovereign wealth fund in all these investments. That will streamline all the supply chains across the region. I wonder if it has been considered at the ASEAN level. If yes, the pros and cons of it, and what are the risks, rewards that have been considered?
Thank you. Let's collect a couple more questions. Yes, in the back there. Get a microphone.
Hi, Chan Siwei here from the Center for International Law, ASEAN Law and Policy team. Thank you for the excellent presentations. I have a question which I think is maybe more for Sanchita and Julia. I was thinking back to the earlier buzzword of, was this maybe 10 years ago in ASEAN, we talked a lot about connectivity and infrastructure, but clearly a lot of the things which were laid out under those earlier plans and priorities are things which are fundamental now for where ASEAN needs to be and where we're moving towards with DIFA. I'm wondering if either or both of you have some views on whether those initiatives, those milestones have been sufficiently completed such that ASEAN can move to where it needs to go next.
Is there one more question that we can have? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll go the same order. Sanchita.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. I will share one thing. I'll take the second question first. Like you mentioned, earlier we used to talk a lot about connectivity and infrastructure. And if you see, we talk about supply chains now. So they are not very different. We are still talking about connectivity and infrastructure, but we are talking about a bit more private sector term. It's a private sector term, and they say supply chain, and it's an end-to-end solution. So again, like I was saying, with time, ASEAN has also managed to evolve and change the narrative. And the other issue with the connectivity and infrastructure was that often it related to the hard infrastructure, even though the master plan for ASEAN connectivity mentioned the importance of institutional connectivity also. But often the discussion of connectivity face challenges the moment we are talking about cross-country infrastructure projects and also who is going to fund these expensive infrastructure projects. So now with this supply chain discussion, what happens is we are talking a lot more about the regulatory issues of the infrastructure. So it's the trade facilitation and the cross-border transportation, transport regulations. So those are also important, and many of these caused the disruption during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you see, they are just two sides of the same coin on how do we basically define where the supply chain ends and where the discussion of infrastructure starts. And going back to the gentleman's comment on does ASEAN has any supranational wealth fund, I'll just briefly mention of that. ASEAN, not for the supply chain, like again going back to the connectivity term, so master plan for ASEAN connectivity is a very expensive endeavor in ASEAN. So what at that time ASEAN thought to form is the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, and which also had a component that they will develop the bond markets for more private sector financing. So all those components were there. But we don't talk much about the AIF now because of many issues at the domestic level. And so there is no as such supranational wealth fund connected to sovereign wealth fund, but there is some ASEAN-wide fund, which is there, which ASEAN constituted some time back. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I may, I'll perhaps focus on the second questions on the connectivity. So often when we talk about connectivity in ASEAN, we refer to the master plan on ASEAN connectivity. There was already an assessment being undertaken, a midterm review, to see the progress that has been achieved to date. But I think that connectivity remains as important now as before. And I would probably see this broader than not just whatever that's contained in the master plan. It's a good document. But if you talk about connectivity, small c, as a concept, that is a concept that actually needs to be mainstream into all the different ASEAN initiatives. One of the problems with ASEAN is that we tend to become quite heavily bureaucratized. When you have new initiatives, new framework, you need additional mechanism to monitor, implement, report, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, there's already existing sectoral bodies working on areas where need to be strengthened when it comes to connectivity. Like, for example, finance. That regional payment connectivity initiative is one of the most concrete initiative that ASEAN has undertaken to date. Whether or not that's part of the impact, I'm not sure. I have to check that, but it's happening anyway. And it's really about internalizing that connectivity consideration, both physical and soft connectivity, into the agenda. Financing is an issue, though, and I think this is something that cooperation can be improved further. There has been some discussions under Indonesia chairmanship, for example. One of the priority economic deliverable is to basically reinvigorate ASEAN industrial project-based cooperation. And that includes looking at the possibility of drawing in not just multiple member states' resources, but also the private sector as well, to focus on project-based priorities that can include industrial sectoral cooperation, but can also look into the connectivity areas. So yeah, I think this is certainly there's certainly room to actually deepen cooperation.
Take that e-commerce question. Thank you so much. Well, ostensibly, the ban was to protect offline merchants from sort of buying and selling on social media. The reality is that many offline merchants came into the online world. I think 1 in 4 merchants, MSMEs, who use digital platforms in some way, and this was really accelerated during COVID. I think the bigger question is, what is a tech company, what's a digital company? And it doesn't fit into your traditional industry sectors anymore, because you'll have a social media company that's becoming an e-commerce platform that is probably also going to have its own financial payment system. So it's kind of a bank as well. E-commerce is alive and well in Indonesia, where this decision was made, has Tokopedia, which is homegrown, but it also has Shopee, it has Lazada. It's got plenty of online to offline platforms like Gojek, Grab is there as well. So it is alive and well. But what I think it's a bigger question, which is to think about, well, technology and digital technologies, you think of it as a sector. This is the tech sector. But it's actually a horizontal as well. At the end of the day, every company is going to be a digital company. Every policy is going to have some element of tech policy in it as well. So it's about wrapping our heads around new business models. And, you know, we talked about coordination and policy coordination before. That's, I think, where internally within governments as well as regionally, that policy coordination has to happen as we wrap our heads around the fact that it's not so much specific industry sectors, but the way in which digital technologies enables cross-sector growth, even within the same company, and thinking about how to govern data across these different sectors.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Technically, we have about 3 more minutes in our quota. So if there's a pressing question from anyone, I don't want to deprive you. But if not, we can probably wrap it up there. Okay, so it's lunch that will win, and I feel good in making up 3 minutes in the overall deficit. Okay, so please join me in thanking our 3 presenters for their excellent presentation.